the hard work. Item number 11, Arts and Cultural Regional Work Programme, and this is a fairly straightforward item. It
I'm happy to
is
move
again
this.
what we did, where we
second.
just vary the budget. Councillor Clow,
Just want a
Councillor
question. I just have a
Philippina,
question.
and a question, Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. Madam Chair, most everything here is self-explanatory. It was just the various gift offers. I mean, it's only 10,000, but I didn't quite understand, and I couldn't find anything in the report. Additional funds required to meet the asset management planning requirements. Does that mean those are items that we've been gifted and we have to plan managing those? That's what I'm not quite sure of, what it means. Can't find a description anywhere.
We're going to have to get
An arty person.
to answer that. I think we might have moved a little bit more quickly than our
Maybe
staff.
Madam Chair, someone can just find the answer for me later. I'm not going to stop this.
It's a good,
but
it's a good question.
There's no real description of what that is from my point of view.
I think we can circulate that. Oh,
Thank
Dean
you.
can.
Oh.
No? Why don't we circulate the answer?
Thank
I think
you,
it's
Madam
a question
Chair.
a few councillors would want to know. So we might just need to couch. We can either come back to this. Let me see what the questions are. We'll see if the questions are of a nature where it would be useful to have a staff member here, and we can always put this off until we can get them here. Councillor Fletcher, are you wanting to talk about Mount Albert?
Yes,
think it
Madam
would be
Chair.
right. I
Having
think-
just attended the sod turning this morning after the long-awaited Mount Albert upgrade, which has been long considered by this chamber, I had no reference from anyone present this morning that they were willing to pull the artwork there. So I really just want some comfort on this matter.
Councillors, I'm going to suggest, why don't we just do a precedent of business? We'll move to item 12. We'll give people a chance to get here, because I know for yourself and for Councillor Casey watching, who is omnipotent and all present at this meeting, that it would be good to be able to answer that. So we'll put this on hold, councillors. We'll move to item 12, and then we'll come back to item 11. So I'll move precedence of business. You happy to second that, Councillor Fletcher? I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. So we'll just tie-ho.
Sorry about that.
Do item 12. I think that's fine. This is probably one of the good things about this, is the fact that people can keep an eye on how the timing's going, and they can use their time wisely. We just seem to have moved ahead with great speed. Now, we might not have our water team here yet, so I'm going to suggest,
Item 13's here.
item 13. Good, so let's just change that and do the item 13 team, and then we will come back to item 11 and 12. Excellent. It's better to do this than have people sitting waiting for items that take forever to get there. So we're now on item 13, everybody. Just to be clear, the appointment to One Voice, and just before we go into the item, I've had Councillor Philippina and Councillor Cooper express an interest in being part of this, so
I'll go with
we'll
my
just
sporty
have a-
chum.
Sure about
any
South
just
side, west side,
introductory
represent.
remarks?
Just very briefly, through the Chair, as outlined in the report, this report seeks council appointment to One Voice, which is Auckland Sport and Recreation Group. One Voice is an Auckland-wide independent voluntary multi-sectoral group that works with Auckland Council and other entities to provide strategic advice and advocates across a single voice for sport and recreation.
So last time we had two councillors and an alternative, so we have got the ability to do that. So if someone would like to, let's get the recommendation up for a start. Is there someone who'd like to move? You're happy to move that, Councillor Simpson, seconded, Deputy Mayor. So we've got speakers. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure, I've been the representative on One Voice since its inception over the previous 2 terms of council. I'm happy to make myself available. I think I've got a fair bit of experience and an abiding interest in sport and recreation across a number of sports. I'm sure I'd have the support of the people on the One Voice team in that regard.
Oh, very good, Wayne.
Okay.
Very good. Awesome.
Well, councillors, as with all of these things, though, we've heard, from Councillor Cooper and Councillor Filipaina, it may be that, given everyone's workloads, Councillor Walker, are you happy to pop yourself in there and share the role with the councillors?
Sure. I mean, it's actually
As an
desirable
alternate?
to have more people there. I was the only one
Yeah.
as a councillor that's pretty much attended the meetings that I can recollect to date, even though there have been other councillors on. So, I mean, by all means, cast the net wide. That's not an issue. There's no issue around space. It's a voluntary group, so there aren't any costs significantly around the group itself.
Madam
Don't
Chair,
want to swamp it. Councillor Simpson.
if I may, look, you've got 3 people who want to do it. Does it matter if we have 3, if you appointed them all and if
Yeah.
only 2 turned up, would that fine?
I think that sounds like,
It's fine.
is that going to,
Is that
will
all right?
One
I mean, I'm
Voice
just very-
feel swamped by having 3 people and they can work it out themselves, just as long as we have some continuity and some enthusiasm?
Through the chair, in the past, not last term, but the previous term, we did have an alternate, and the reality of when we tried to not schedule the meetings when councillor meetings are on, but the reality is that sometimes councillors are unable to make it.
Lovely. I think we've got a solution. I'm
Madam-
going to,
about
quick while I'm
IMSB?
ahead,
You are
Member
ahead.
Brown.
You are ahead. However, I note in the earlier tenure that we had an independent Māori statutory board member included in this group, who's sitting to my left, remains available for the Māori board to continue their presence, and want for the committee to consider that. I'm unaware of the origins of the last tenure and how my fellow member was included.
Sorry, I may have read this incorrectly. I presumed that that was in the hands of the Independent Māori Statutory Board, that we provided elected members and Independent Māori Statutory Board provided Independent Māori Statutory Board.
Thank you. We're happy with that. Just wanted that on.
Good.
Thank you.
Cool.
Although, point of clarification, in my nomination of Independent Māori Statutory Board Wilcox in the last term on the Parks Committee, it was on the basis of his skill sets representing the general, the general grouping. So he was an outstanding member and representative for that role. So
Regardless of
while
being
I am, yes, so while I'm happy to see it as an AMSB appointment, I do want to draw attention to the fact that he discharged his duties with great aplomb.
And we could be a bit sneaky then, Councillor Fitch, and we can say we've provided our elected members and IMSB can provide the IMSB member, and we can get that.
Or for the price of
that
3.
Indeed, they'll be delighted. So I will just take it that the Independent Māori Statutory Board will provide a wonderful person. Okay, I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 Against? Carried. Awesome. Right. Okay. So who's arrived out or water? Water's arrived. Good. Water got in first. So let's move to item 12. And just while everyone catches their breath, I just want to take a moment. There's been a little bit of media around this and a bit of preemptive media around this issue, which I want to put in context, and it's quite important to do so. We have a submission in front of us that's been prepared by our staff. They've synthesised a whole lot of exceedingly complex information and put together a very good submission based on the questions that the government have asked. It is, however, absolutely clear to us as elected members, that the issue is wider than simply some of the freshwater issues that the government has raised, that the Auckland region is entirely different to the rest of the country, and as the biggest rural council and the biggest urban council, our issues are of stormwater and water quality in our urban area as well. So it's to that end that we really welcome the group that has announced their getting together, the Stormwater Alliance. I can't remember the name of the group, but I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us to work with that group, and hopefully a group of councillors and independent Māori statutory board member who work on now our interpretation of what's required in this submission. So just to clarify, I think some of the media and some of the comments was that Auckland Council is simply focusing on cows and paddocks. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are absolutely focused on urban stormwater quality, but the questions posed by government did not envisage a submission that would do that. So this is now our chance to put that in there. So I want to, first of all, before we embark on the item, I want to acknowledge our staff who've been doing this work, and I want to signal very, very clearly that for the next couple of weeks we will continue to work on this submission, including those much wider issues of urban stormwater and urban water quality. So, sorry to do a big long introduction, but I think it's very important that we just get that out on the table. So, welcome to our team, led by Dave, who've been working on that. And thanks for the energy that's been put into this. So there's a reasonably comprehensive PowerPoint thing. I just forgot what it was called for a moment. One of these things. That thing. There's quite a big one of those. But because it is a complex issue that we need to be very clear on, I'm keen that we take the time now to do this well. So thank you.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today on the government's proposals for clean water and the proposed Auckland Council response to that particular package. Do I have a slide thing? Yes, let's grab that. So perhaps just some opening remarks. This has been quite a contentious issue around the country. It's generated quite a lot of interest in terms of people's interpretation of how freshwater outcomes should be achieved. It's an ongoing issue. It's been with us for some time in terms of the need to implement the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. The government package looks to address responses to the next steps for freshwater package that was released in about February last year. Auckland Council submitted on that at the time, and what the current clean water package does is picks up on some of the key points in that, which is on the third bullet point there, changes to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, some of the technical aspects, but it also introduces ministerial targets for swimming, and that's partly because the response from the public at large, about 4,000 submissions last year, was along the lines that they didn't want to necessarily focus on just wadeability as a sort of bottom line for achieving water outcomes. They wanted to actually have something more like swimming as a bottom line. And what the intent of the Minister's approach is to sort of say, well, how are we going to address that target? So he set some central government targets that he wishes the people, the community, and also councils around the country to work towards. So I'll talk about that briefly, and I'll also then talk about some of the maps that have been produced to map swimmability, and that has been produced as an information piece for the community, and it is basically a national indicative piece for everyone to look at and make some sort of broader observations about swimmability as it stands today. And then there's a couple of other issues within the package that includes the observation about how the Freshwater Improvement Fund would work and there's some criteria that we'll look at. And similarly, there's a proposal to introduce national stock exclusion regulations, which were an issue that was were entertained last year when the Next Steps for Fresh Water was advanced. So we'll just work our way through these 5 components. So firstly, the swimmability target, the 2 ministerial targets are up there on the screen. 80% of large lakes and rivers are swimmable by 2030 and 90% by 2040. Large lakes is defined as 4th order streams or above, and that is typically streams that are of a depth of 40 centimetres, sufficient for swimming in. And I guess that's the only reason why that was used as a target, was that they were trying to focus on what are the rivers that would typically be used for swimming in. The issue that's then raised is what about small rivers, which is really important for Auckland. And I guess the key thing we're saying here is that these targets don't necessarily remove the need for us to have management goals for those small rivers, but we need to be very clear as to getting clarity from government as to what the intent is now with the focus of councils as it may relate to small rivers. So we'll get onto that in a minute. The model itself was developed using quite a lot of historic data and focused on some predictive values which included things like climate, river flows, land cover usage, geology and catchment size and elevation. And there are some concerns by staff about the method used. It won't necessarily in the future pick up, for example, let's say we put in a whole lot of mitigations to improve a particular outcome for a watercourse. That won't be picked up in the model outputs because the inputs are only related to some of those fixed variables. So we feel that the model as itself, as a tool, is not necessarily going to have future application as it stands. The other thing is that the model is all about providing an indication of the level of E. coli in rivers or cyanobacteria in lakes. So they're sole indicators, and so it doesn't actually sort of talk about the flow of a river, it doesn't talk about the flooding, the turbidity, those sorts of characteristics which you might want to look at if you're going for a swim. And so the key point here is to note that, and it's quite clearly indicated in the consultation material, that this is focusing on E. coli as a clearly an important value to, attribute to assess in terms of public health and reducing the risk of public health issues going forward. Now, I've just mentioned just broadly that the use of the maps in the future, it's uncertain as to how they'll be used. This has been quite a big exercise for MFE and their consultants to get these maps done originally. But in doing so and actually putting out these maps around the country, they've actually created quite a kerfuffle. Quite a lot of people are quite concerned about the utility of these maps. And they are something that we'll have some ongoing discussion about, I would suggest. So just what does this look like in practice? The map for the Auckland region, that's it up there, it basically sets out to describe what the swimming categories are for each of those rivers, whether they're in an excellent condition, a good condition, fair condition, intermittent or poor condition. There is not a lot of rivers or lakes in the Auckland region simply because of the fact that we don't, just by our geography, we don't have 4th order rivers and we don't have large lakes which would meet the sort of test for what that might involve, which is 1,500 metres perimeter to actually be suitable for this particular methodology. The maps are an information tool. They're not suggesting that we would want to use this information in a comparative sense with other centres, although that's how it has been used. We've made it quite clear to MFE that when you look at the Auckland map, it may include a lot of model data and real data which may have been collected over a number of years for state of environment reporting, which may not be comparable to the kinds of data that's been collected in Taranaki or Hawke's Bay or wherever else. So they are intending to try and make this a national indicative descriptor of how suitable water quality is for swimming. And the other comment, obviously, is that the current focus for Auckland Council has been to put a lot of effort into coastal swimming locations by virtue of the fact that people swim more on the coast. So, this is one of the big things that we're sort of observing, is that we've already got an existing program in the coast. If there will be a need to shift our emphasis or add to our emphasis to the freshwater, that will obviously have implications for resourcing these kinds of issues. So the categories that I had in the figure before are sort of from excellent through to poor, blue through to red. And I guess the other observation here is that there are 4 different metrics that have been put up on the MFE website for discussion. But in terms of what's included in the consultation document, they only include the first column in the National Objectives Framework, which is the percentage of exceedances over 540 E. coli per 100 mils of water sample. So and I guess the relevance of that we'll see in the next couple of slides, but the point that we want to really make here is that the more measures or metrics that you use, the more richer description you will have of the actual water quality outcome. However, this, and again, you don't need to focus on the actual sites here, but there's
I can't read it.
Yep. It's simply to note that the first column there gives you an indication of the different levels or different categories that are applicable to each of those sites. But then when you add in the other metrics on the right of that, and when you actually look at assessing them against those metrics, you might actually get a different result. So a river that might have a blue category, let's say, or I don't know, a yellow category, might be a red category in the next column over or something like that. So it depends very much which metric you use, and I guess what we're trying to do is to seek some guidance from MFE as to how this will play out in the actual final description of how these metrics will be used. The Minister has indicated in a separate letter from the consultation document that he is thinking about using all 4 of these metrics to better address the risk profile for E. coli. But in terms of what's in the consultation material, it's only the 1 metric in the National Objectives Framework that's actually listed. So MFE have said to us that they expect this to change, so we're not sure where it's going to go, basically, but I guess they're talking within the realm of these 4 metrics. But I guess the message here is that you do get different outcomes for the different metrics. And that is a slide that simply is just showing you a distribution of the current metric for exceedances of E. coli over 540, the first column. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of poor quality rivers in the urban area. I should also just note that a lot of the monitoring sites used here are for state of the environment reporting, which is not necessarily the same kind of monitoring that you would do or in a methodological way for assessing swimmability. So it's an important point. We might need to look at changing how we go about actually collecting some of the data if it was to be used for a different purpose. Maybe one other comment I'll make before I get onto this slide was to note that the amount of data required is about 100 samples over, so it's actually, if these samples are collected on a monthly basis, it's potentially 5 or 10 years before you have sufficient data before you can actually officially rate where you sit with your particular river in a particular site. So it may be that you don't have you don't have until like 2017, let's say if we started now, 2027, an actual indication as to how we're tracking against some of these metrics. Now you can obviously use preliminary assessments based on a small amount of data, but I guess what's intended through the target and the NPSFM is that there's a minimum of 100 samples collected, which is typically once a month for 10 years. Changes to the NPSFM. Several of these are fairly technical. One of the things that flow on from the targets that are set by the Minister, or desired to be set by the Minister, is that the suggestion is that councils will need to be identifying large rivers and lakes suitable for immersion in their regional plans as a mandatory outcome, and that's probably in some light to kind of provide some transparency as to how a particular council is progressing towards the swimmability target. In terms of our response to that, we're kind of the view that having a plan change to actually track your progress is not the most efficient way to do these sorts of things, and there are other more efficient ways to actually provide more live, up-to-date information on websites and things like that. But the overall intent is to improve water quality so that the risk to human health is reduced. So a number of the changes in the NPSFM are focused on moving more to a risk-based approach, which is actually quite a good message because that actually links in a little bit with some of our marine sampling through SafeSwim. And I guess the other thing is that the Minister's expecting that our regional targets and how they might contribute to the national picture, that councils will need to provide a provisional kind of list of what are the rivers that the council might wish to intervene in, and what are the likely costs of the interventions expected by about September this year, and by about March 2018 that we'll provide some sort of finalised list of what interventions the council might wish to pursue to move towards these targets. That in itself is quite a big ask in terms of actually having a pretty good picture as to where things are at, but I guess that's a case of how difficult do you want to make that and how detailed do you want to make that. But I think it's important to note that there's an expectation from the Minister, Nick Smith, to have that information by March next year. I want to talk, and I guess the only other comment there is that there's a likelihood of new costs in terms of monitoring and compliance activities. That's sort of all wrapped up in all these additional changes that are being proposed. I wish to raise the macroinvertebrate community index. This is an index that's used to kind of give you an indication as to changes in ecosystem health based on the macroinvertebrates in the river. It's well used, but it's also well regarded as something that's got an indicator value, and it has limitations in terms of how it could be interpreted. One of the issues for this particular index is you can't necessarily link cause and effect. It's an indicator. You probably need other measures to sort of align to actually give you a much better picture of what's going on. So this has been widely used in the past on a voluntary basis, but the intent of the NPSFM changes is to make this a mandatory requirement. Because of the limitations in the use of this index, we have had quite a lot of internal discussions about whether or not Auckland Council might support this. We note that Watercare has indicated because of the limitations that they may look to oppose its use. And I guess the other comment I'd make is that last year in the Next Steps to Fresh Water, we also indicated that it has limitations. So I think the messages that Auckland Council put down last year was pretty consistent with where we probably might land on this, but at the moment we probably would need to pick up some text that Watercare have provided us and probably build that into the draft consultation, proposed submission that you've got in front of you, which is only about 3 or 4 lines at the moment. One of the other things that has been raised is more explicit consideration of economic issues, and this differs slightly for water quality issues as opposed to water quantity considerations. In the case of water quality, you must ensure that everything is in a good space for water quality in terms of some of the ecosystem health outcomes before you then consider economic opportunities. In the case of water quantity considerations, they use the word while. So in other words, you can ensure that you meet certain ecosystem health outcomes while providing for opportunity for quantity outcomes or considerations. So there is a bit of a legalese sort of issue here, and there is simply a case of saying, okay, you've set out different kinds of ways that economic considerations are considered for quality versus quantity. So this is something we need to think about and ask for some clarification on that. Auckland Council's current implementation program is quite adaptive and will be needed to be refined as a result of the changes that have been put forward by the NPSFM if they are adopted by government. Moving to the criteria for the Freshwater Improvement Fund, this is the simplest part, I think you could say, of the whole package, in the sense that they're basically indicating that they've got $100 million available in a fund to direct towards vulnerable catchments, which are catchments in their mind that are at the tipping point as opposed to ones that might be already degraded. So they're trying to say, well, let's find catchments that we think with a bit of investment could be turned around. Now, they've used various criteria to actually identify what might be vulnerable catchments in the Auckland region and elsewhere and around the country. And there's only the Hoteo River in the Auckland region that they regard as vulnerable using the criteria that they have used. Our first reaction when we saw this was, well, that wouldn't be our first pick necessarily, but we as officers are preparing a bid to advance some work there, because we've just got some other work that's coming to a conclusion at this point, and it does provide an opportunity to sort of piggyback on the back of some good work that's about to finish in the Kaipara. And Northland Regional Council is also putting up some work in the Kaipara as well. So actually there's a number of reasons why it's probably quite a good project. But we actually will signal, and I guess what we've signalled in the submission is that we feel that there is opportunity to consider eligibility criteria in a broader context going forward, and particularly looking at some of the tools that might be used in the future to address both rural and urban issues. So it might be mitigation issues that haven't really been historically considered. So the bid preparation date for this exercise is quite distinct from the submission, which is more about what the criteria that are being utilised going forward. So we're preparing a bid under the criteria that they've put out, but we're also in the submission, we're suggesting through yourselves that that could be a bit broader still. The stock exclusion regulations, now the big issue for Auckland Council is that you've just gone through an an Auckland Unitary Plan exercise that's become operative, where you've gone about identifying rules for stock exclusion that relate to the number of stock units per hectare. You make reference to permanent streams versus intermittent streams. You have a 5-year and a 10-year phase-in for those approaches. The stock type that is covered off by that particular rule set includes horses, sheep, goats, which are not included in the national regulations proposals. And there are a range of exclusion methods available to achieve the outcomes in the Auckland Unitary Plan. In the proposed national regulations, they are basically looking at regulations which are also phased. They apply to a smaller range of stock types, the main ones being the cattle, beef, dairy, and pigs and deer, and they're also looking at the class of slopes. So they're looking at sort of the flat ground, the rolling ground, and the steep land, and looking at sort of what rules you might apply on each of those different gradients at certain time periods. There is a provision in the regulations to allow for a farmer, let's say, to apply for a stock exclusion plan with the council. The basis for what would be considered by the council in considering such an application is completely unknown. There is no sort of clarity on how that would be assessed, and MFE are well aware that that's the case. And the question would be, what level of consistency might you want across the country? How would you approach this on an individual farmer basis? What level of servicing would you be required to have in place to actually address these requests? So, and there's a couple of other things that are different in the national regulations. Some of the national regulation measures are better than the Auckland Unitary Plan, others are not necessarily so. And the more broader point, though, is that the submission really sort of sets out that we need to really evaluate if the two approaches can be integrated. There are a number of operational problems to how this might be implemented. Having two different sets of rules will also be quite, confusing or potentially. I guess what we're sort of looking from the council is to get a bit of direction as to how you might want to approach this issue, because I think it's actually quite complicated. So I'll just leave it there for the moment. Just brief. Ooh, we've just lost the slide.
That was it.
I was going to say, just getting on to the next steps. There we go. The close date for submissions is Friday the 28th of April. The suggestion is that we get a finalised submission to the Chair on the 26th of April for her consideration, signing off. And to do that, we would need to have final input from what we've suggested, which is a subgroup of councillors to look at the proposed submission. And before that, there will be a scan of other regional sector discussions, which have been very ongoing, and also we are hoping to get some further direction from MFE in terms of any further updates from them as to how some of these proposals are going to be interpreted. I've just put down here some of the things that the council might want to build on in the submission that aren't necessarily there already, that we've got, the draft submission. Clearly we need to get some clarity as to how the minister's targets and the intentions of various councils, how they're going to work together, and how they're going to be identified by March 2018. There's a question about some of the requirements in the NPSFM in terms of the need to identify some of the large rivers and lakes in a plan change. One of the key points we noted is that some of the large rivers and lakes that were identified by MFE, and there are about 30 for the Auckland region, are just totally inappropriate in terms of being reference sites. They are, for example, sewage ponds is one example that I discovered. And the mangroves in the Luke Street area in Otahuhu. So, and the other one that we've noted as well is that the water supply areas, so the Hunua dams and also the Waitakere Reservoir, are probably not appropriate, and in the sense that they're not accessible for public swimming. And Watercare is quite strong on those issues, and we want to just make that observation that we will be looking to include those points in the submission and actually provide a full table of all the 30 different sites, and of those 30 sites, probably 6 or 7 will be probably not appropriate to be included as reference sites. Stock exclusion national regulations, I guess I just should also mention that I was down at Wellington last week, and MFE staff there indicated that they're still working through a whole lot of work about effectiveness of various proposals.
Say again?
MFE are still working through the effectiveness of particular proposals, and so what that indicates to me is that we really need to sort of have a hard look at what's been put in front of us and say, is there an opportunity to look at some sort of transitional provision or savings provision that we don't go down a particular pathway until we know for sure that we're actually going to do the right thing? I guess it's a combination of how much time do you want to allow that to sort of be considered before taking action. And as I mentioned before, stock exclusion plans don't provide any grounds for assessment or a basis for refusal. There will be a lot of requirements on council to implement some of the NPSFM changes, as well as some additional monitoring activities for meeting the targets. And the other key thing is that the NPSFM discussion in Wellington seems to be kind of divorced from some of the other big policy initiatives. And I guess we would need to really say, well, how does this all relate to sort of changes to the RMA? How is this going to change to the initiatives for transport and housing and some of the bigger questions? And so we haven't done that in the submission, but it would be quite a reasonable issue in the Auckland context section, the introductory paragraphs to the submission, for some of those other points to be raised. And that's what I've finished off on there, is to note that we could include that. And the only other comment I think is that we could also include mihi at the start of the submission, which I thought I'd raise, that we hadn't omitted that in terms of what we intended to do. The only other observation is that we have received local board input from the Kaipatiki local board last night that pointed to observations about poor outcomes for small streams as a result of stormwater and sewage issues in the Birkenhead area. And the other local board was the Albert Eden board, which provided a more technical response, and I think that reflected the fact that the staff member involved there has had actually some involvement in MPSFM work in the Waikato over the last 5 years. So that will be a useful one for us to look at. And as I said, we've had observations from Watercare in terms of some of their significant concerns about how reference sites are selected, and also their concerns about MCI. And probably in the introductory text, it would be useful to perhaps note some of the Watercare infrastructure as part of the Auckland context. So I think that covers off as much as I need to cover off at this point.
Fantastic, thank you. It is a complex and huge issue, so just a couple of quick points. The issue of the mihi has been raised, and the staff are very keen to work, I think, with the Independent Māori Statutory Board members on the correct mihi, and you'll note in the second recommendation we've added, of course, Independent Māori Statutory Board member for the group who'll be working on this. So we'll take questions first, and I will divide this into questions and then the recommendations. So, Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you very much. And